Lust in the Moonlight. Welcome to our channel, where we flirt with the mind and bring your deepest desires to life through stories. Today we have a mesmerizing story about a man that howls to the moon, that desires Selene for himself. Can they truly be together? Will their love be accepted? Let's find out in Lust in the Moonlight. Can she resist his temptations or release herself to her desires? Please remember to subscribe if you enjoy the story. The moon hung low in the night sky, its pale light bathing the forest in a silvery glow. A soft breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and jasmine. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though the night itself knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. At the edge of a secluded meadow, a small cottage stood, hidden from the world. Its thatched roof and stone walls blended perfectly with the natural surroundings, making it appear as though it had always been there, a part of the forest. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the crackling of a fire and the soft flicker of candlelight. Selene sat by the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the delicate patterns of frost on the glass. She gazed out at the moonlit landscape, lost in thought. Her heart raced, anticipation coursing through her veins like wildfire. Tonight was the night. She could feel it deep in her bones. The forest had always called to her, ever since she was a child. There was something about the way the trees whispered secrets, the way the moonlight danced on the leaves, that made her feel alive. But it wasn't just the forest that beckoned her tonight. It was him. Rael had come to her in dreams, his dark eyes smoldering with desire, his voice a velvet caress that sent shivers down her spine. She had never seen his face in the waking world, but she knew him, knew his touch, his scent, the way his presence enveloped her like a warm embrace. He was as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves, a creature of the night, wild and untamed. As the hours passed, the fire in the hearth burned lower, and Selene felt the pull of the moon grow stronger. She couldn't wait any longer. Rising from her chair, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out into the night. The cool air kissed her skin, sending a thrill of excitement through her. The forest was alive with the sound of nocturnal creatures, their movements hidden in the shadows. Selene's heart pounded in time with the rhythm of the night, her every step taking her deeper into the woods. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't need to. The forest would lead her to him. As she walked, the moonlight seemed to guide her, illuminating a path that wound through the trees. The world around her blurred, as though she had stepped into a dream. Time lost all meaning, and the only thing that mattered was the growing sense of anticipation that pulsed through her. And then she saw him. Rael stood in the center of the clearing, his silhouette outlined by the soft glow of the moon. He was tall, his body lean and muscular, his dark hair falling in wild waves around his face. His eyes, deep and mysterious, locked onto hers, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. "Selene," he murmured, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver of desire through her. She stepped toward him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Rael," she breathed, her voice barely more than a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, sending sparks of electricity through her skin. "I've waited for you," he said, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I've waited for you too," she replied, her voice trembling with longing. Rael's hand slid down to the nape of her neck, pulling her closer until their bodies were mere inches apart. The heat between them was palpable, a magnetic force that drew them together. Selene's breath hitched as his lips hovered just above hers, teasing her with the promise of a kiss. "Do you want this?" he asked, his voice rough with desire. "Yes," she whispered, her pulse racing. "I want this. I want you." With a groan of need, Rael closed the distance between them, capturing her lips in a searing kiss. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them, lost in each other. His hands roamed over her body, igniting a fire within her that burned hotter with every touch. Selene's fingers tangled in his hair as she pressed herself against him, desperate for more. She could feel the strength of his body, the raw power that simmered just beneath the surface. And yet, there was a tenderness in his touch, a gentleness that made her melt into him. They moved together as if they had done this 1,000 times before, their bodies perfectly in sync. The forest around them seemed to pulse with life, the air thick with the scent of earth and wood and desire. The moon watched over them, its silver light casting a glow on their entwined forms. As their passion built, the world seemed to shift. The boundaries between reality and fantasy blurred, and for a moment, Selene wasn't sure where she ended and Rael began. All she knew was the heat of his skin against hers, the taste of his lips, the sound of his breath mingling with her own. Time stretched and contracted, the moments between them both infinite and fleeting. Their connection was primal, ancient, as though they had been lovers in lifetimes past and would be again in lifetimes to come. It was a dance, a ritual, a communion of souls beneath the moonlit sky. When the climax came, it was like a tidal wave crashing over them with a force that left them both trembling and breathless. They clung to each other, their bodies still intertwined, as the aftershocks of their passion rippled through them. For a long time, they lay together in the clearing, their bodies bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. The forest was silent now, as though it too had been sated by their union. Selene rested her head on Rael's chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his skin. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his breath, the beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was peaceful, serene, a moment of perfect contentment. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that this night had been more than just a dream. "Rael," she whispered, lifting her head to look into his eyes. He gazed down at her, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" he asked softly. "I don't know," she said, biting her lip. I feel like this is the beginning of something bigger than us." Rael's eyes darkened, and for a moment, a shadow passed over his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "This is only the beginning. There are forces at work that you cannot yet understand. But know this, Selene, I will always be with you, no matter what happens." She frowned, a knot of worry tightening in her chest. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the sound of a distant howl echoed through the forest, sending a chill down her spine. Rael stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the source of the sound. "They're coming," he murmured, his voice tense. "Who's coming?" Selene asked, her heart racing with fear. Rael turned to her, his expression serious. "The night is not just a place of passion and desire, Selene. It is also a place of danger. You must be careful. The forest holds many secrets, and not all of them are kind." With those cryptic words, he pressed a final, lingering kiss to her lips before disappearing into the shadows, leaving her alone in the moonlit clearing. Selene stood there, her heart pounding, her mind swirling with questions. Who was Rael? What had just happened between them? And what was coming for her in the night? As she gazed up at the moon, its silver light seemed to shimmer with hidden meaning, as though the answers she sought were just out of reach. But one thing was certain. Her life had changed forever. Lust in the moonlight had awakened something within her, something powerful, something dangerous. And now, she would have to face whatever the night had in store. The cold of the night wrapped itself around Selene, but she barely noticed as she stood in the clearing, trying to grasp the enormity of what had just transpired. The passion that had surged between her and Rael still clung to her like a second skin, but now a new sensation was creeping in. Uncertainty. The howl in the distance echoed again, closer this time, more urgent. The sound sent a ripple of fear through her, and her instincts screamed at her to return to the safety of her cottage. But Rael's words echoed in her mind. The night is not just a place of passion and desire. It is also a place of danger. A rustling sound in the bushes startled her, pulling her attention back to the present. Her breath hitched as she peered into the darkness, her eyes straining to see what lurked beyond the trees. The moonlight flickered through the branches, casting strange, not shifting shadows on the forest floor. Then, from the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. Selene's heart leaped into her throat, and she took a step back, her body instinctively tensing for flight. But the eyes, golden and predatory, were locked on her, unmoving. She knew, deep down, that running wouldn't save her. The creature in the shadows was too fast, too cunning. Slowly, almost unwillingly, the creature emerged from the bushes, its massive form stepping into the light. It was a wolf, but unlike any wolf Selene had ever seen. Its fur was as black as the night itself, shimmering like obsidian in the moonlight. Muscles rippled beneath its sleek coat, and its gaze was intelligent, too intelligent for a mere animal. The wolf regarded her with a strange, almost calculating intensity, its golden eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Selene could feel the wild energy of the forest vibrating around them, thick with magic and mystery. Then, to her shock, the wolf's form began to shift, its body contorted, limbs stretching and bones cracking as it transformed before her very eyes. Fur receded, replaced by smooth, pale skin, and the once beast became a man, a tall, impossibly handsome man with the same glowing golden eyes and dark hair that cascaded over his broad shoulders. Selene gasped, stumbling back. She had heard stories of shapeshifters, but never had she imagined encountering one herself. The creature, took a step toward her, his gaze still intense. His presence was overwhelming, his raw, primal energy making the air around them hum with power. "Who are you?" Selene whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and curiosity. A slow smile spread across the shapeshifter's lips, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of a predator who had found something intriguing, something he intended to claim. "You may call me Kale," he said, his voice a deep, velvety rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "And you, Selene, you are even more exquisite than Rael described." Her heart skipped a beat. "You know Rael?" Kale's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I know him very well. He is of the night, just as I am. But where he is ruled by his desires, I am ruled by something far more dangerous." Selene's mind raced. She had felt the pull of Rael, his intoxicating allure, but Kale was something else entirely. There was a darkness in him, a hunger that terrified and fascinated her in equal measure. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Kale's gaze flicked over her, his eyes darkening with desire. "I want what Rael had tonight. But more than that, I want to taste the power that lingers in your blood, Selene. You are not just an ordinary woman. The moon calls to you, doesn't it? You feel its pull, its magic." Her breath caught in her throat. How did he know that? How did he know about the strange connection she had always felt to the moon and the forest, a connection she had never been able to fully explain? "I can feel it," Kale continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "You are tied to the night in ways even Rael cannot comprehend. But I understand, and I can show you things you've never dreamed of." Selene's pulse quickened as he drew nearer. She wanted to resist, to pull away from the overwhelming intensity of his presence. But something in his eyes, something in his words, held her captive. He was dangerous, yes, but there was a part of her that was drawn to that danger, a part that craved the wildness and freedom he represented. Before she could respond, Kale's hand reached out, brushing her cheek with surprising gentleness. The touch sent a spark of heat through her, and her body betrayed her by leaning into his palm. "You are stronger than you know, Selene," Kale murmured, his golden eyes flickering with something dark and alluring. "And that strength, that power, it is what I desire most." Selene's breath came in shallow gasps as Kale's touch ignited a fire within her, a fire that rivaled the one she had felt with Rael. But this was different. This was darker, more dangerous. Kale's hunger was not just for her body, but for something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "What if I say no?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and defiance. Kale's smile faded slightly, and for a moment, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed his face. Something like respect. "Then I will not force you," he said quietly, though his eyes still burned with desire. "But know this, Selene, the night is not done with you, and neither am I." With those final words, Kale turned and melted back into the shadows, his form once again shifting into that of the sleek black wolf. Selene stood frozen, her heart racing, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. As the night swallowed him up, she was left standing alone in the clearing, the moonlight still bathing the forest in its eerie, silvery glow. But the night didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt charged, dangerous, alive with possibilities both exhilarating and terrifying. Selene turned back toward the path to her cottage, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and desire. Rael, Kale, the strange pull of the moon and the forest, everything was changing, and she had no idea what was coming next. But deep in her heart, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever awaited her in the night, she would face it. Even if it meant surrendering to the dark, wild desires that pulsed within her, like a heartbeat echoing through the moonlit forest. Selene's footsteps were slow and hesitant as she made her way back toward the cottage. Her body still buzzed with the lingering touch of Kale, his words echoing in her mind. The night air was cool against her flushed skin, but the heat that simmered inside her refused to fade. She reached the door of her cottage and paused, her hand resting on the handle. The fire inside had burned down to embers, but the flicker of candlelight still danced across the walls. The familiar warmth should have comforted her, but instead, it only reminded her of how her life had changed in the span of a single night. Closing the door behind her, Selene pressed her back against it and let out a shaky breath. The desire that Kale had stirred in her still pulsed through her veins, a relentless force that demanded release. Her mind raced with thoughts of him, his dark eyes, his touch, the way his voice had wrapped around her like a silken thread, pulling her closer to the edge. But it wasn't just Kale who haunted her thoughts. Rael. His name whispered through her mind, and with it came the memory of his touch. The way his hands had claimed her, the way their bodies had moved together beneath the moonlight. It had been raw and primal, a meeting of souls as much as flesh. And now, even as the night closed in around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she still belonged to him. Selene's heart raced as she pushed away from the door, her body acting on instinct more than thought. She crossed the room and stood before the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. Wild hair, flushed cheeks, lips still swollen from Rael's kisses. Her fingers trembled as she reached up to unlace her dress, the fabric slipping from her shoulders and pooling at her feet. The cool air kissed her bare skin, but it only seemed to fuel the fire burning inside her. She closed her eyes, her mind conjuring images of Rael, his strong hands, his heated gaze, the way he had made her feel as though she was the only thing that mattered in the world. The thought of him consumed her, and a soft moan escaped her lips as her hands moved over her own body, tracing the paths that Rael's fingers had followed earlier that night. Every touch sent a jolt of pleasure through her, but it wasn't enough. She wanted more. She needed more. "Rael," she whispered, her voice trembling with longing. As if summoned by her desire, the air in the room seemed to thicken, and a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Her eyes snapped open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Rael. His eyes were dark with hunger as he stepped toward her, his body radiating an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He said nothing as he closed the distance between them, but the heat in his gaze spoke volumes. Selene's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, her body humming with anticipation. She wanted to run to him, to throw herself into his arms and lose herself in the wild passion that had consumed them before. But there was something different about him now. Something darker, more dangerous. Without a word, Rael reached out and took her hand, pulling her close until their bodies were pressed together. The heat of his skin against hers was electric, and she could feel the raw power that simmered beneath the surface of his calm exterior. "I told you I would always be with you," he murmured, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down her spine. Before she could respond, his lips crashed against hers, and the world around them seemed to dissolve. There was no hesitation, no gentle prelude, only raw, unbridled need. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her even closer, and Selene moaned into his mouth as the intensity of his kiss overwhelmed her senses. Every touch, every breath, was charged with a hunger that had been building since the moment they first met. Rael's hands moved over her body with a possessiveness that made her knees weak, his fingers digging into her flesh as though he couldn't get enough of her. Selene's hands found their way to his chest, tracing the hard lines of his muscles before sliding down to the waistband of his pants. Her fingers fumbled for a moment, but Rael growled against her lips, his patience clearly wearing thin. With one swift motion, he grabbed her wrists and pinned them above her head, his eyes dark and wild as he stared down at her. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this," he whispered, his voice rough with desire. Selene's breath hitched as she looked up at him, her body trembling with both fear and excitement. She had never seen him like this before, so intense, so utterly consumed by his need for her. And yet, despite the danger that seemed to pulse in the air around them, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. She wanted him. No, she needed him. Rael's lips found her neck, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down to her collarbone, and Selene gasped as his teeth grazed her skin. Every touch sent a wave of pleasure through her, and her body arched toward him, desperate for more. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Rael's hands tightened around her wrists as he pressed her harder against the wall, his lips brushing her ear. "Is this what you want, Selene? Do you want to surrender to me?" Her heart pounded in her chest, her body aching with desire. She had never felt so completely out of control, so utterly consumed by another person, but in this moment she didn't care. All that mattered was the heat of his touch, the fire that burned between them. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling with need. "I want you." Rael growled in response, his hands releasing her wrists as he pulled her close, his mouth claiming hers once again. The kiss was fierce, almost desperate, and Selene's fingers tangled in his hair as she pressed herself against him, her body responding to his every touch. Their movements became frenzied as the fire between them built, a wild, untamed passion that consumed them both. Rael's hands roamed over her body, igniting every nerve ending, and Selene's moans filled the room as he guided her toward the bed. In one swift motion, he lifted her onto the mattress, his body hovering over hers, the weight of him pressing her down into the softness. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and smoldering with desire. "This is only the beginning," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. And then, with a ferocity that took her breath away, Rael claimed her. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of their passion, the heat of their bodies, and the undeniable connection that bound them together under the moonlit sky. The room was filled with the heat of their entwined bodies, every touch and movement igniting something deeper within them both. Selene's breath came in ragged gasps as Rael's lips moved from her mouth to her neck, leaving a trail of fire across her skin. His hands explored every curve, every delicate contour of her body, like he was committing her to memory with each stroke. She could feel the raw intensity of his need, but there was something else in his touch, something more than just passion. It was as if, in this moment, Rael was pouring everything he had into her, not just his desire, but his soul. And she welcomed it, her body arching beneath his, craving more of that connection, more of him. His lips found the sensitive spot just below her ear, and Selene's moan filled the room, the sound raw and unrestrained. She had never felt anything like this before, this all-consuming fire that seemed to burn through every part of her, leaving her weak and trembling in its wake. Rael's hands slid down her sides, his fingers grazing her hips before moving lower, teasing her with the promise of more. Her heart raced, her pulse quickening with anticipation as he drew closer to the place where she needed him most. But he was in no rush, taking his time, savoring every inch of her. "Rael," she gasped, her fingers digging into his shoulders, urging him on. But he didn't respond with words. Instead, he captured her lips once more in a deep, searing kiss that stole the breath from her lungs. His hands finally moved lower, and when he touched her, a cry of pleasure escaped her lips, her body arching off the bed. The feeling was overwhelming, like nothing she had ever experienced. His fingers moved with expert precision, driving her closer to the edge with each tantalizing stroke. Selene's world narrowed down to nothing but the heat of his touch, the rhythm of their bodies moving in perfect harmony. She was lost in him, completely and utterly consumed by the pleasure that surged through her. Every nerve in her body was on fire, and she could feel the pressure building inside her, a tight coil of need that was about to snap. Rael's lips brushed against her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Let go, Selene," he whispered, his voice rough with his own desire. "Let me take you." His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she surrendered to the wave of pleasure that crashed over her. Her body trembled, her breath hitching in her throat as she fell apart in his arms, her release washing through her like a storm. Rael held her through it, his touch gentle yet firm, guiding her through the intense pleasure that left her gasping for air. When the waves finally subsided, she lay limp beneath him, her heart racing, her body still humming with the aftershocks of her release. For a moment, the room was quiet, the only sound the ragged breaths they both drew as they lay entwined together. But Selene could feel the tension still thrumming in Rael's body, the heat of his need still pulsing between them. She opened her eyes to find him watching her, his gaze dark and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. There was desire, yes, but there was something deeper, something more intense that made her heart skip a beat. Without a word, Rael shifted, his body pressing closer to hers, and she felt the full weight of his need against her. The fire that had just been quelled began to build again, a slow, burning ache that spread through her with every touch, every brush of his skin against hers. Selene's breath caught in her throat as Rael moved above her, his gaze never leaving hers. There was a tenderness in his touch now, a careful reverence that contrasted with the wild passion that had consumed them before. He lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was softer, more deliberate, but no less intense. Their bodies moved together as if they were made for one another, every touch, every thrust driving them both higher, closer to the edge of oblivion. The connection between them felt almost otherworldly, like the night itself had conspired to bring them together in this moment, under the silver glow of the moon. Selene's hands roamed over Rael's back, her nails digging into his skin as the tension built once more, a slow, intoxicating burn that left her trembling. She could feel the intensity of his need, the way his body moved with hers in perfect rhythm, as though they were two parts of the same whole. As their pace quickened, the fire inside her grew hotter, fiercer, until it was almost too much to bear. Rael's name spilled from her lips, a breathless plea that was answered by his own groan of pleasure. The world around them disappeared, and there was nothing but the two of them, lost in the heat of their passion, their bodies entwined in a dance as old as time. Selene felt herself teetering on the edge once more, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she held on to him, her anchor in the storm of sensation that threatened to consume her. And then, with one final powerful thrust, they both shattered, the pleasure tearing through them like a force of nature. Selene cried out, her body trembling as the release ripped through her, wave after wave of ecstasy washing over her until she could hardly breathe. Rael followed her over the edge, his body tensing as he buried himself deep inside her, a low, guttural sound of satisfaction escaping his lips. They rode the wave of pleasure together, their bodies locked in perfect harmony, until the intensity slowly ebbed away, leaving them both trembling in the aftermath. For a long moment, they lay together, their breathing slow and labored, their hearts pounding in sync. Selene felt a sense of peace wash over her, a deep contentment that she hadn't known was possible. Wrapped in Rael's arms, the world outside felt far away, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly safe. Rael brushed a strand of hair from her face, his gaze soft as he looked down at her. There was a tenderness in his eyes that made her heart swell, and she knew in that moment that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "I'm not letting you go, Selene," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet determination. Selene smiled, her fingers tracing the strong lines of his jaw. "I wouldn't want you to." Selene lay in the aftermath of their passion, her body still tingling with the remnants of the fire they had shared. Rael's breath was warm against her neck, his arm draped possessively over her, as if even in sleep, he couldn't bear to let her go. The night outside was still, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting a soft silver glow over the room. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Too perfect. Selene closed her eyes, trying to hold on to that feeling of peace, of safety. But deep inside, a strange unease stirred. Something was different. Something was off. Rael shifted beside her, pulling her closer, and the familiar warmth of his body should have comforted her. But instead, it sent a chill down her spine. Selene's heart quickened, her mind racing as fragments of the night came rushing back. Kale, the dark shapeshifter, his predatory gaze, his promise of power. Her fingers grazed over Rael's arm, the solid muscle beneath her touch reassuring. But then, as she traced the lines of his skin, something caught her attention. A scar, jagged and unfamiliar, one she had never noticed before. Her breath hitched, her heart pounding harder now as she pulled back slightly, her gaze dropping to his hand. A ring glinted on his finger. Her stomach twisted in a knot of confusion. Rael had never worn a ring before. Selene's heart pounded louder as she gently pushed him back, her eyes narrowing as she took in his form. The man beside her wasn't Rael. "Cale?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stirred, and then his eyes opened, those same golden eyes that had watched her from the shadows earlier that night. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, her breath leaving her in a rush. It hadn't been Rael who had made love to her, who had whispered promises in her ear and taken her to the edge of pleasure and back. It had been Cale, disguised as Rael. Selene scrambled out of the bed, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled back, her mind reeling from the betrayal. How could she not have known? How could she have let herself be so completely fooled? Cale sat up slowly, a wicked smile curling at the edges of his lips. "You really didn't know, did you?" His voice was rich with amusement, as if her shock was exactly what he had been hoping for. Selene's hands trembled as she backed away, her mind spinning. The way he had touched her, the way he had kissed her, it had felt so real, so right. But now, standing before him, all she could feel was a deep sense of violation, of betrayal. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaking with both anger and confusion. Cale stood, his golden eyes glowing in the moonlight as he approached her slowly, like a predator stalking its prey. "I told you," he said softly, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You belong to the night, Selene, and so do I." She shook her head, her mind unable to process the truth that was staring her in the face. Everything about him was wrong, his smile too sharp, his gaze too cold. The connection she had felt with Rael, the love they had shared, was nothing like the dark hunger that radiated from Cale. "You tricked me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Cale's smile widened. "No, my sweet, you wanted this. You wanted the darkness, the danger. I simply gave you what you were already craving." Selene's skin crawled as his words sank in. She had been vulnerable, yes, drawn to the wildness of the night, the power it offered. But she had never wanted this. She had wanted Rael, the man who had made her feel safe, cherished, loved. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but Cale was already closing the distance between them, his hand reaching out to cup her face. His touch was gentle, almost tender, but Selene recoiled from it as if it burned. "I could have given you everything, Selene," Cale murmured, his golden eyes flashing with something dark and dangerous. "You could have ruled the night by my side." Selene's heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run. But something kept her rooted in place, something in the way he looked at her, as if he truly believed she would choose him over Rael, over the life she had known. "You'll never have me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Cale's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, but then it returned, colder and sharper than before. "We'll see about that." Before Selene could react, the air around them shifted, a cold wind sweeping through the room as the shadows lengthened. Cale's form began to shimmer, his dark, predatory gaze never leaving hers as he slowly dissolved into the night. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Selene stood there, her heart still racing, her mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. The room felt colder now, emptier, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she buried her face in them. How had she been so blind? How had she allowed herself to fall for Cale's trickery, to mistake his dark desire for Rael's love? The answer was simple. She had been seduced by the night, by the very thing that had always called to her, and Cale had used that to his advantage. But as she sat there, her mind slowly clearing, one thought rose to the surface. A thought that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. Rael. Where was Rael? Selene shot to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest as she rushed to the door. If Cale had been with her all this time, then where was the man she loved? What had Cale done to him? She burst out of the cottage and into the cool night air, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she scanned the forest around her. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ground, and for a moment everything was still. But then, from the darkness, a familiar figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair as dark as the night itself. Selene's heart leaped in her chest, a mixture of relief and fear flooding through her. "Rael!" she cried, running toward him. But as she drew closer, her steps faltered. Something was wrong. The man standing before her wasn't Rael. Not really. His eyes, once warm and filled with love, were now cold and distant. His posture, once relaxed and open, was rigid, almost mechanical. Selene's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. This wasn't Rael. Kale's voice echoed in her mind, mocking and triumphant. You could have ruled the night by my side. He hadn't just tricked her, he had taken Rael's form permanently, trapping the man she loved somewhere deep inside, forever hidden beneath the shapeshifter's dark, twisted desires. And now, as she stared into the eyes of the man who wore Rael's face, Selene knew with chilling certainty that she would never truly escape the night's grasp. She had been claimed, after all.